Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I am so excited we're spending this time here today. We have quite an inspirational show lined up. Our first guest is none other than Rutger Bregman. You've been probably familiar with his work. He's been featured on The Washington Post, The Guardian, and on BBC. He recently also did a TED Talk that went viral in regards to the topic of poverty, which is also a topic that he discusses in his book, Utopia for Realists. So let's welcome to the show, Rutger.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, what a joy it is to have you here. You have to be like the youngest historian out there.
Yeah, I am. Am I not? You usually think of very old men with gray beards, but I do have a beard, but it's not gray.
Well, this just means that you're extra brilliant, and by your book, that's very easy to see.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. So what prompted you to follow this path of becoming a historian?
Well, I always loved history when I was in high school, and I always had this dream of just becoming a high school teacher. I wasn't very ambitious when I was in my teens. But then when I went to university, I actually really, really liked it. And then I had the dream of doing a PhD and becoming a professor. But when I when I started doing my research, I realized that if I would stay in university, I would have to spend like 4 years of my life researching a subject that I didn't really care about, some boring thing that happened in the 13th century or something like that. And I wanted to ask the big questions, what is the meaning of life? What is progress? Where do we go in the future? But that's not really what they do at university nowadays. So that's why I decided to go somewhere else and try journalism. And now I find a place at the Correspondent, a small Dutch journalism platform that just lets me write about whatever I want.
Well, little did you know you'd be a historian rock star, right?
Yeah, I didn't know that.
So I heard your TED Talk, the one that went viral in regard to Utopia for Realists, and I have to ask, so when it got time for you to develop this content that for the topic for the TED Talk in your book, what was the main inspiration behind all of that?
Well, I've been fascinated for quite a while by a very old idea, the idea of a universal basic income. Now, this goes back all the way to the 15th century. I think that history is often a big inspiration. If you want to look for new ideas, you can often just look to the past. And it's an old idea that basically says, let's just give everyone free money, an unconditional basic income to just completely eradicate poverty. And when I first found out about it, it seemed pretty crazy. But then I started researching it, and I found, experiment after experiment that happened in the 60s and the 70s, for example, in the US and Canada, that showed it's actually a really successful idea. And what's even more bizarre, I discovered that Richard Nixon, of all people, almost implemented it. So that's sort of how it started for me.
And then for your TED Talk, I was just so touched and moved by your discussion, because a lot of times people, when they, if they look at people who are in poverty, they say, well, it's because they don't have character, or they have really poor skills, or they're all drug addicts, or they have poor money management skills. What did you learn during that whole process?
Well, you're absolutely right. I actually quote at the beginning of my TED Talk, I quote Margaret Thatcher, the famous British Prime Minister. And she once said that poverty is a personality defect. Now, that sounds really harsh, but actually most people think that way nowadays. People on the right think that the poor are lazy and, they need to be forced into work. And people on the left often think, well, the poor may not be lazy, but at least we need to help them, help them to make better decisions, because we can't trust them to make their own decisions. But what I found out when I really delved into this research, I discovered that poverty is not a lack of character, it's just a lack of cash. And if you eradicate poverty, if you get people above the poverty line, they start making much, much better decisions. It's all about the context, or what psychologists call the the context of scarcity.
Yeah, they're a little bit better with their resources, knowing that it's limited, but it will cover what they need to have.
Exactly. You could compare it to, having not enough time. Maybe you're sometimes really busy, and if people become really, really busy, they start making, unwise decisions. They're not planning for the long term anymore. And poverty is basically the same thing. People who are poor are really good at managing their short-term problems. For example, if they go to the supermarket, they know very, very well how to get the cheapest products. They're much better at that than rich people are. But in the long term, they start making pretty unwise decisions. They eat less healthfully, they care for their kids less well, they get less education, etc., etc. So if you get people out of poverty, is what this research shows, people start making much better decisions, especially in the long term.
Well, and I think that's good to touch on that and talk about that, because I mean, a lot of people do think if someone is in extreme poverty or in an impoverished condition, they brought it on themselves. It's got to be that, as opposed to a lot of people maybe going through situations where bad economy plus medical conditions, and before they know it, they're in a position they never thought they would be in.
Exactly. And nowadays there's a vast industry, of all kinds of bureaucrats and paternalists who are all trying to help the poor with their problems. There's a mountain of studies now that suggest that, for example, financial literacy training, just helping people to manage their money, it doesn't help at all. It's completely ineffective, but still we're spending millions and millions of money on it. So what I suggest in the TED Talk is that we should just give the salaries of all those care workers and all those people who are employed in this industry and just give it to the poor themselves, because they know way better than we do what to do with the money. And if you don't believe me, just look at the research. This is, for me, it's not some kind of ideological thing or anything. It's really what the research points out.
Well, how long did you do the research that brought you to your conclusions? I know these things can take some time.
Yeah, it took quite a while, actually. I became first interested in basic income because I had become convinced that, especially in a country like the US, we had to start working less. I think that in many ways, our work weeks are way too long, and that there are a lot of problems that go together with that. Stress, even climate change, too much consumerism, you name it. So I was just thinking, how can we get people to work less? So I was sitting in my chair and thinking about it a bit more, and I thought, what would happen if you just give money to people? Probably at some point they'll start working less. So that's when I started Googling that, free money, basic income, etc. And I quickly discovered this whole concept. And I also quickly discovered that it's a really bad way to get people to do or work less. Most people, especially the poor, actually work more. They get up and do something. But that's, by complete coincidence is how I stumbled upon the idea. That's what often happens. I don't really have a plan often. I just somehow, these ideas.
They find you.
Yeah, that's how it works, I guess.
So what would be some of the ways that, let's say, like if we were to implement this here in the U.S., what are some of the ways, and you talked about giving those salaries and that money that is used for education on how to manage finances to the poor. What are some other ways that they could implement a basic income?
Well, it's very important to remember that a basic income is just a basic income. It's just enough to pay for your basic needs. So food, shelter, a little bit of clothing. And in that way, it's not a very radical idea, actually. Some people think that it's really expensive to eradicate poverty. Well, it's not. For example, if you look at what they call the poverty gap, that is the collective amount of money that the poor are together in the US, for example, are beneath the poverty line. It's just 175 billion. Now, that's a quarter of the military budget. It is about 1% of GDP. So that's entirely doable. And I also believe that, especially in the long run, this is an investment that will pay for itself. Because again, what we see in those experiments is that healthcare costs go down, crime goes down, kids perform much better in school, etc., etc. So this is an investment with a great return on investment.
I definitely believe that, especially because I mean, the people who are below the poverty line or at the poverty line, they're having to make some really tough decisions on, what they can afford and what they need to do. And so
Exactly.
it's a lot. I can imagine that being a lot of stress and just really difficult. What countries have, I know you talked about Canada has implemented, what other countries have implemented this that's been widely successful?
Well, just 5 years ago, it was a completely forgotten idea. I mentioned that in the 60s, almost everyone believed that some form of basic income was going to be implemented in the US. Richard Nixon, he had a bill that proposed a basic income. It got Congress twice, actually, but then the Democrats voted against it because they wanted a higher basic income. It's a pretty bizarre history. I've got a full chapter on it in the book. It almost happened. But now, in the past 5 years, the idea is back. Finland has started a big experiment just last year. Canada has announced another big experiment. And in Silicon Valley, there are a lot of people interested in basic income as well, because they think that the robots are going to take all our jobs. So we cannot rely on the job market in the future to redistribute all the incomes. What I think is really, really interesting here is that it's nowadays often politicians on the right who are most interested in this idea. Many people think, basic income, that sounds very left wing, It sounds like a very loony leftist idea. Actually, in Finland, it's a center-right government. In Canada, it's a conservative senator that is, the big force behind this experiment. And it's easy to see why. A basic income is all about individual responsibility. You can completely decide for yourself what you want to do with it. And in that sense, I think it would mean real freedom for everyone.
Now, are you, because this information in your book has really taken off. I mean, people, I just love to hear you speak on this topic, and I can see why you're very, very eloquent, and you really bring some good points to the table that have people really thinking about this in a completely different way. Are you kind of spearheading a campaign on this? What's in the future for you?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm just proud to play a role in this movement. I mean, the basic income movement is much bigger than I am, and a lot of people play different roles in it. I've always believed in the power of ideas. There are some historians who say history in the end is ruled by money and by power. That's just it. Especially the Marxists, they always say, it's just money and power, and that is what determines who gets what in the end. Well, I'm a little bit different here. I've always believed in the power of ideas, and that sometimes very few people or small groups with just a very good idea can make a big difference. What I point out in the first chapter of my book is that every milestone of civilization, the end of slavery or democracy or equal rights for men and women, these were all crazy ideas once, but now they're just reality. So it happens all the time that crazy ideas can become reality. And often these ideas do not start in the center where the powerful people are, where the rich people are. No, they often start at the fringes of society. To give you one example, the women's right to vote. At the end of the 19th century, women started arguing, for example, in the UK, we want the right to vote. Were they the most powerful group in society? No. Were they the richest group in society? No. But they did have the best idea. So I think that history shows time and time again that ideas can and do change the world. It's just that nowadays we often lack the imagination to dream big.
Yeah, and sometimes it's easier to, especially when you have politicians that don't want to upset their constituents, it's easier to just kind of go with the flow than to bring something to the table that really would benefit people on a greater scale.
Definitely. It's always easier to safeguard the status quo. That's always the easy way. I'm not saying it's not going to be difficult. But if you want to change the world, you need to be unreasonable. You need to be unrealistic. You need to be irresponsible, because it's those kind of people who, in the end, make a difference.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I mean, I know there are a lot of people that have been talking about this topic for quite some time. But it really seems that the way that you have presented it has really captured people's attention from all different age ranges as well, which is kind of important. Maybe that's why it's such a big deal that you're the youngest historian doing this, because you're reaching an audience that most people would have a tough time getting to.
Well, I always try to talk in a way to make it as accessible as possible for as many people. When I look at the modern economy or the modern system of education, I see that a lot of people are being educated to make things as complicated as possible. That is basically what business school and law school is about nowadays. That is how it works. So let's make all these organizations as complex as possible, and then there'll be a big need for managers who are going to manage all this complexity. It's very, very easy to make things more difficult, but it's pretty difficult to make things a little bit easier. And my job as a historian, as a writer, as a journalist, is to make things a little bit easier, because often, it's not rocket science what I do.
You would think it is, right? It sounds like I'm sure you get quite a bit of pushback too, because some people are like, wow, we don't really want to pay for all the people who are poorer in our country. Why would we? It's just going to be too much. I'm going to make less money. So when you have people that have that kind of pushback, what is some of the things that, because I know it's all about education and meeting people halfway and explaining things so that there's a greater understanding. What things would you say to some critics in regards to that?
Well, the two criticisms that I get most often is the first one is, if you will give everyone a basic income, most people will stop working. They'll be lazy, because that's what's in human nature. If people are not forced into work, they'll just stop working. And we can argue for a long, long time about that. What I propose is, let's just look at the evidence. Let's look at the scientific research that has been done. We've got a lot of research right now. And then what we'll find is that most people want to make something of their lives. Most people are quite ambitious, creative, but they often lack the means. So that's the most important, the criticism I get most often. The other thing that people often say is, well, it's a very nice idea, but we can't pay for it. It's just too expensive. And my response there is very simple. What we really can't pay for is poverty. If you look, for example, at a recent study that was done in the US, estimated the cost of just child poverty at $500 billion each year, in terms of higher healthcare spending, higher crime rates, kids performing less well in school, you name it. So poverty, especially child poverty, is the biggest waste of human potential we've got. And that's happening every single day. So if people say that we can't afford poverty, I just say we or we can't afford to eradicate poverty, we just can't afford to not eradicate it.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, I personally grew up in an impoverished condition as a child. And so going through that, it was much more difficult to, I always knew that it's like, hey, I'm going to get ahead, I'm going to do it. And I see that a lot throughout the country, where people are met with great adversity, where they need to rise above that. And they end up being sometimes some of the people that end up being on the forefront of dramatic change. So it's interesting. I think from a people perspective, I mean, we can't afford not to invest in people,
Maybe there's the problem nowadays is that there are so many politicians in the US, but also in Europe, who are thinking in zero-sum terms. They think that if I win, you lose. If you win, I lose. That is basically the worldview of Donald Trump, for example.
Yeah.
My book is about win-win solutions. So you benefit, I benefit as well. That is basically the story of modern progress in the past 200 years. We all got a lot richer in the past 200 years. We all got a lot healthier, wealthier in the past 200 years. That is what progress is about. We all should be winning. If you eradicate poverty, the rich will benefit as well, because they'll live in a nation with less people living on the streets, where people are healthier, where people are smarter, where we invest more in the kids. They come up with all kinds of great ideas and inventions. You name it. We all benefit from that. There's a great poet who once wrote that no man is an island. And I think that we too often forget that.
Yeah. So what if they talk about the segment of the population that maybe they're veterans, or they have mental health, veterans that have mental health needs, or individuals who do fall within that category of, because we have a huge opiate addiction problem here in the U.S. What if they fall within those categories? How would the basic income work for this segment of the population? Is it just blanket, across, regardless of what's going on with them personally, or is there some kind of assessment that's done to to help people manage their funds?
Well, to be honest, I think you need a very good reason to introduce any kind of assessment, because assessments mean bureaucracy. Yeah. They mean paternalism, and we then often start assuming that we know better what's good for people. Actually, I cite one study at the beginning of my book with an experiment with 13 homeless men. And these were living on the streets of London in 2009, and some of them for more than 40 years. And they were really regarded as hopeless cases. Everything had been tried at that point, and there was an organization that said, all right, let's try something radical. Let's try something new. Let's just give them £3,000. Now, that's quite a lot of money. And they were completely free to decide for themselves what to spend it on. And even at that organization, people said, well, they're probably going to waste it. I mean, some of these people were addicted to drugs, and this was a quite radical idea. But then a year after the experiment, 7 out of 13 of the men had a roof above their head. 2 more had applied for housing. One of them had took gardening classes. They had been very frugal with the money. One of them had spent it on a hearing aid, another on a dictionary, another on a passport. It was the biggest success in years with these men. And what's maybe even more fascinating is that it wasn't even really the money that made the difference. It was just the trust. These men had been distrusted by society for a very long time. And then suddenly someone came to them and said, you know what? I think you can make something of your lives. And to prove it, here's £3,000. And it was just incredible what happened. I think we need to be open to those kind of findings from that kind of research.
I think that's actually very heartwarming, because one success story is just worth it, Just sure, having one person that's able to, especially when they're dealing with mental health issues or drug addiction issues, it's interesting because every single person's worth it, worth the opportunity.
Yeah, and I mean, there's an even bigger movement which is called housing first. So I said poverty is basically a lack of cash. Well, then if we go on thinking about homelessness, well, that is just a lack of a home, right?
Yep.
So there's a whole movement, which is quite powerful in the US as well, that says, let's just give free apartments to the homeless. I've got one story in the book about a guy in Utah. Now, this is a quite conservative guy, a Mormon who grew up on a ranch and always believed, you had to work for your own money. But then he went to a lecture where someone said, well, if you look at the financial side of this issue, it just makes sense, because it's most expensive to let people live on the streets. Again, healthcare costs, police costs, judicial costs. It's way cheaper to just give them a free apartment and invest in their lives. And that's how he became convinced. And this guy is called Lloyd Pendleton, and he's the one responsible for the almost complete eradication of chronic homelessness in Utah. Quite fascinating.
That is fascinating. I'll have to look more of that up. I know here in Colorado, and we've got very extreme temperatures here, so one day it's 70 degrees and the next day it could be 30, with a major snowstorm during those first spring months. And they've implemented what's called a temporary, like tiny homes for the homeless so that they at least have some type of shelter. And so they're starting to do that as a project going forward, which is actually really encouraging.
That's great.
Yeah. So, well, Rutger, oh my goodness, I could talk to you for days. You're just amazing individual. I absolutely love your book, and I believe everyone needs to go out and pick up a copy. It's very well written, Utopia for Realists. Where can our listeners find you and connect with you?
Oh, that's very easy. I just got a website, rutgerbregman.com, and they'll find more about me there.
And they can see your TED Talk that you did on there, which is worth the watch. I loved it. Absolutely loved it. I think I've actually watched it a few times already because I'm just like,
thank you. That's so nice.
Out.
It's exciting to do. So.
Are you doing another TED Talk coming up soon?
Oh, no, never in my life. That was
The one that you got it done, you're done. Okay, I get it.
Yeah. They always say no one wants to do a TED Talk, but everyone wants to have it done,
Yeah, it's a lot of prep and a lot of setup for all that. So, well, we're going to be watching, because I'm connected with you on Facebook and Twitter, and gosh, I'm watching everything that's coming through, and it's very dynamic stuff, interesting stuff on what you're doing, and I highly suggest our listeners do that. Rutger, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.
It was a definite pleasure. We'll have to have you back when you have any new book, for sure.
All right.
We're going to pause here for a quick break, and we'll be right back after these messages.
Internationally recognized and award-winning author Judy Goodman works and teaches outside the box of limited thinking. Working with people from every walk of life, her goal is to empower you to be the best you can be, no matter what the challenge is. Born with the gift of seeing beyond our normal vision, she has an extraordinary gift of working with every challenge. Teaching beyond conventional wisdom, her work is described as life-changing. Visit judygoodman.com. That's judygoodman.com.
Have you ever had the sense that your thoughts might actually be doing something? Ancient secrets of manifesting have been masterfully revealed in the award-winning book Manifesting 1-2-3 by Ken Elliott. For the first time, the author's experiences and stories in this book describe exactly how your thoughts can create anything. You've been doing this all your life, but it's never been fully explained for you until now. Visit manifesting123.com for more information today. Manifesting123.com.
Ben Wexler is a gifted leadership development and strategy consultant for professionals who want to transform their organizations and careers. Through a uniquely personalized set of processes, participants discover their unique knowledge, how to leverage that knowledge and experience, and then put it all together with a global strategy. You're more valuable, your organization is more valuable, and the change is viral. Contact Ben at 630-881-1074. 630-881-1074.
Welcome back to Moments with Marianne. So our next guest, I'm just so delighted to introduce him, Danny Goldberg. And so if you know anything about the music industry, you know his name. Danny's here today to talk to us about his new book, In Search of the Lost Chord, 1967 and the Hippie Idea. Danny has worked in the music business as a personal manager, record company president, public relations man, and journalist since the late 1960s. During that time, Danny managed careers of bands and musical talent such as Steve Earle, the Cranberries, the Hives, Harper Simon, and Peaches. From 1983 to 1992, Danny was the founder and president of Gold Mountain Entertainment, a personal management firm whose clients include Nirvana, Hole, Sync Youth, Bonnie Raitt, and the Beastie Boys, just to name a few. So let's welcome to the show, Danny.
Hi.
Oh, what a joy it is to have you here.
Well, thanks. I appreciate being able to talk about my book and being able to talk to you.
Well, I've got to say, a book is quite a journey, and it really kind of breaks down for people who are curious about this period of time, that, like, what happened and really kind of how it shaped America today. So I have to ask you, why did you write about 1967 and not like a period either before or after that?
Well, I've always, I graduated from high school in 1967, and so it's always loomed in my mind as an interesting year personally for me, but also I was very affected by the 60s culture. It was my adolescence just was there when it was happening, between the war protests, the spread of psychedelia, the explosion of certain kind of rock and roll, the beginning of Eastern spirituality being part of the general pop conversation. And it bothered me the way the 60s have been depicted in a lot of the kind of histories, whether it's CNN documentaries or History Channel or things like that, because so much of those things seem to focus on protest, and the hippie part of it is sort of cartoonized, kind of peace and love as a slogan. And and some of the fashions and a few photos, but the emphasis seems to be more on some of the later years. 68 obviously was a convulsive year when Dr. King and Robert Kennedy were murdered, and there were riot outside, violent confrontation outside of the Democratic Convention in 68, and 69 Charles Manson emerges, and so on. But I felt 67 was kind of the peak of the sweet part of the 60s, before some of the darkness took over in a greater proportion. But when it already was just reaching kind of a mass pop stage, there were always bohemian ideas in Western culture, going back hundreds of years, and things like the Transcendentalists and early American history, and the beatniks in the 50s. But the thing about the 60s was some of those ideas, questioning materialism and kind of just, the meaning of life, and questioning sexual repression, and the ideas of pacifism and a lot of other ideas, became part of the mass media, because the baby boom generation, the largest generation in history, the media had changed in a way that it made it easier for underground media to come into existence, and the establishment media, LaVena now, was run catering to advertisers, and advertisers wanted young people. So and music in particular, had this ability to spread some of these ideas to millions of people. So I just thought 67 was kind of the sweet spot. And there's so much happened in the 60s. Narrowing the focus allowed me to have kind of more of a close-up on the granular details of what was happening when I was a kid. So it's not a memoir. I mean, I wasn't doing that much interesting as a teenager that's worth writing about. That's like maybe 2 or 3% of the book. It's a history where I just went back to try to understand exactly what was going on during that year, the combination of things that gave me that feeling of being part of some new culture. And so that's the subtitle of the book, is 1967 and the hippie idea, for that reason.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, and I agree with you. I was born in the late 60s, but when I see depictions of the 60s era and during that time, it is always like flower power, peace. They've got like these little, little snapshots of how it's depicted, and there's so much more that happened during that period of time. I mean, you were part of the protests in Berkeley when they were, I guess you guys were attempting to shut down the draft board. Yeah.
Well, I went to school, I graduated from high school and got into the University of California at Berkeley and went out there, and it was the first time I was living out of my parents' apartment, and a friend of mine and I from school rented an apartment together, and like the first week we were there was this protest in Oakland. The conceit of the protest was that they were going to, quote, shut down the induction center, and a lot of the protests had these sort of exaggerated claims of what they were going to do, and I have mixed feelings about that. I was against the war. I started reading about it in high school. I felt that it didn't have anything to do with American security, that it was kind of a knee-jerk reaction to a Cold War mentality that was so powerful in the establishment, but that hadn't been reevaluated for like 20 years, and there was nothing particularly democratic about the government that we were propping up, and it became this huge thing. No one knows what would have happened if President Kennedy hadn't been assassinated, but under President Johnson, I mean, it went from 30,000 people there to 500,000, 20 million young men were susceptible to the draft. And so I was against the war, but I wasn't really part of the anti-war movement in terms of being part of these committees or organizations, because, there was kind of an anger and a grimness about some of it that turned me off. But I supported the goals of it, and, we figured, let's be part of this, and there were all these people, kind of pushing cars into the into intersections and trying to block traffic. And, in retrospect, I don't think that's a particularly effective way of turning the society writ large against the war. But it was kind of a lot of fun as a teenager to be part of it. And it was a period when I researched it where some of the organizations had gotten frustrated with intellectual and peaceful protest and thought that this kind of confrontational tactic would be more effective. And, ironically, the word resistance was the buzzword of that year, as it is for a lot of people today who disagree with the Trump administration policies. And, I try in the book to recognize and honor the people who had the courage to be against the war and to question it because they were right. Today, the fact that Vietnam won the war had zero effect on American security. It's a vacation destination today. Nothing bad happened. No dominoes fell. It's hard to justify the enormous loss of life. The people who question it, I think, have been vindicated by history. But, being just yelling at the top of your lungs and being angry is not a strategy that's particularly effective in really transforming public opinion or the society. And to me, the hero of the 60s is still Dr. King, who had this brilliant combination of militancy and love that I think had a more lasting effect. So I try to, but I have compassion for the anti-war people because they didn't know what to do. The normal discourse of congressional hearings and teach-ins and articles weren't working. So I just try to create a mosaic of all the things that were happening. That particular thing I was there for, and there was tear gas and people crying and running around, and it was very dramatic. At the time, I thought I was part of history. In retrospect, it was not that big a part of history.
Well, it's so interesting to see all the different aspects of this. My father was in Vietnam, and he was one person out of his entire platoon that survived this battle. And I agree with you, the amount of human loss was just absolutely tremendous. And so, kind of looking at that, and I've also interviewed Dr. Larry Brilliant, who talks about his journey as well, and he's associated with Wavy Gravy.
Yeah.
So it just puts together these pieces because there's so many different perspectives at the time, and it's interesting because a lot of people really didn't want to be part of of a war like that.
Well, it was a different war. Listen, my dad served in World War II, and he was, to this dying day, he had some bad memories
Mm-hmm.
Seeing his friends killed and killing people in the war, and it was a tough experience for him, although he believed it was the right thing to serve. He did not particularly encourage me or my brother to serve in Vietnam because he questioned it for the same reasons we did. I will say this, I don't know what happened in every circle of the counterculture in the 60s. For me and my friends had friends who were vets who were back from Vietnam. When I got to Berkeley, my next door neighbors and best friends were two Vietnam vets who'd gotten back a year or two earlier, and the people I respected and knew never had anything but respect and appreciation for the risk and the suffering that the vets went through. They were sincere. And served. We questioned the State Department and the President for the policy that put them in harm's way. And I think later on, and I think the effective part of the protest, again, some of this confrontational, quasi-violent protest to me was in retrospect ineffective, counterproductive, and not always morally defensible. When people's lives were put at risk for domestic things being blown up or something like that. But I think the most effective protests were the Vietnam vets against the war who came back and had the moral authority of their service, but still questioned the policy for the same reason that the rest of the anti-war movement did.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I'm a big supporter of our military, and we ask them to do a lot sometimes, and it's just like, we just have to
but the leaders, sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong, and there are a lot of different motivations in the leadership that are not always pure. And I think if it's a democracy, you're entitled to question the government. Vietnam was a huge division in the country. I think some of the divisions that we have today started then, and I wish the country was less divided, and I think that's one of the things in studying the 60s to try to figure out on our side what did we do wrong that contributed to those divisions. But I still don't think there's any moral justification for the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
In terms of the leaders, I think there's great admiration due to the vets, and I don't see why those two facts can't be separated.
Mm-hmm. I think people look at it more like that now than they have a little bit more perspective in regards to that situation.
Yeah.
That time period. Now, I know part of the hippie idea was the ability, and you talk about it in your book, it was like this direct connection with God was being taught. And it's kind of the birth of that. I know you talk about in People's Magazines had a headline that said like God is dead. I mean, how did you feel during that period of time with all this going on?
Well, I grew up in kind of a secular Jewish family in the New York area. My parents, culturally were proud of being Jewish, and still remembered some sentences from Yiddish that their parents had spoken, and certainly didn't like anti-Semitism. But our connection to the religion was pretty superficial. A couple of ceremonies, Hanukkah and things like that, and they were not really a member of a temple. I wasn't bar mitzvahed, neither was my brother. And there we were taught ethics and values, and that was sort of that was the religion in our household was art, respect for creativity, and respect for ethics, and kind of a progressive, what today would be called progressive politics. And I honor that, and I try to live up to it. At the same time, there were people that grew up in repressive religions where there were rules about sexual behavior that made them uncomfortable. Of course, there were people that grew up in inspiring religious environments and stayed with it, and these things were all happening at the same time. But to me, the dominant religion of America, the dominant belief system that I grew up into was materialism. You sort of see it in flashes of it fictitiously depicted in the TV series Mad Men, and the idea of just inquisitiveness and the struggle for status. And Richard Alpert was a Harvard professor, a protege of Tim Leary's, obviously later became known as Ram Dass after he went to India, and very close to Larry Brilliant, who you mentioned. And he talks about the fact that as a young man, he did everything he was supposed to do in the society, got the best academic degrees, became a professor at Harvard, made enough money to own his own small airplane, was respected publicly, but felt this inner emptiness, that there was something somehow more to being a human being than just the external ideas. And for some people, the taking of psychedelics kind of redefined themselves more as souls than just their external role. And that was definitely the effect initially that LSD had on me also. And I think that it became perverted. It became just sort of a party thing. It became the province of dope dealers who chemically sometimes made it more dangerous. That people were taking it without the kind of supervision and thoughtfulness that the pioneers had. And also, after a certain point, Albert himself said that, he recognized that he kept coming down, and by the end of 1967, he went to India and ended up meeting his guru and got connected to more traditional Eastern spirituality. And the more you get into any of these spiritual paths, as you know, and I think talk about, they're all connected and part of the kind of the same truth. But the unique thing about the late 60s was that these ideas, which are normally are kind of the province of talking to therapists or small prayer groups or the inner searching of people, became part of the mass public conversation. Today we talk about Donald Trump all the time, but in those days people were talking about this stuff all the time. The Beatles, the most famous people in the world, became interested in meditation and the tradition of bhakti yoga and, many other artists. I named my book after an album that the Moody Blues recorded called In Search of the Lost Chord, where they explored these things. So there was this sort of year or two where it was part of pop mass culture. And I think that's a good thing, and I think it influenced a lot of people. I mean, Steve Jobs, the creator of Apple, was inspired by it, as he writes, Oprah Winfrey, and, the modern environmental movement, the proliferation today of yoga, mindfulness, and all these things all really entered the pop mass mainstream through the window of the late 60s culture.
Mm. In your book, and you kind of touched on this a little bit, you talk about Robert Kennedy's quote of a speech he did in 1968. And when I read that, I really felt like he was talking to us today, with the lack of poverty in resources, in character, and it was just, it really struck me. I was.
Well, I was very affected by that speech when I reread it also, and I was very affected by rereading a lot of Dr. Martin Luther King's sermons and speeches in the last year of his life. And these were two men in their 30s. I think Bobby Kennedy was in his early 40s. Dr. King was in his late 30s, who were certainly not part of the counterculture. They wore suits. Their hair was shorter. Extremely unlikely they took LSD. But yet they were affected by all this, and they became the bridge between the counterculture and the established order. They really they had more in common with the Haight-Ashbury ethos than I realized. There was this general questioning of what the meaning of life should be and what the priorities of a society should be. And, we'll never know what the world would have been like if they hadn't been murdered in 1968. But we do know that for that moment, there was a very broad conversation going on in the country. And although it didn't translate overnight into a change in government I think culturally over the 50 years, it influenced a lot of things, certainly the growth of feminism, the gay rights movement, the environmental movement. And as we were saying, mindfulness all comes from that period. And there were other things that have not changed yet, the materialism and militarism and the propensity for tribalism, where groups of people just dehumanize other groups, including in our political world, or some of the same problems that were around 50 years ago. But I'm inspired when to really reread what Bobby Kennedy and Dr. King were saying then, is to really recognize the possibility of what national leaders could be, and something today for all people who want to be national leaders to aspire to.
I think it gives hope, for sure. Reading that was...
It gives me hope. And the other thing that gives me hope is there was a lot of darkness going on at the same time. My kids are in their 20s, and they feel in some ways this is the worst things have ever been. And look, I'm very worried about the world. I'm not a supporter of the Trump administration, but this is not the worst things have ever been. We had slavery in this country. Women couldn't vote till 1920. J. Edgar Hoover was a far more venal head of the FBI than anyone we've had recently. And we don't have a military draft. We don't have millions of people there are too many people dying in the world, but we don't have a war of that scale. Race relations are still a serious issue in America, but they're a lot better today than they were 50 years ago. So I think it's important to remember that the peace and love was not happening in a comfortable situation. It was happening in a time of crisis, not that different from the one today.
Yeah, it really kind of was born out of all these, it was a very tumultuous time when all these things were taking place. But, again, I think it really does give hope to people during this time and also perspective, because you were going through so much and a lot of things were happening during, the 60s. And for a lot of generations that weren't born during that time, or, because I remember the 70s, and there was stuff going on during that time too, but it just was such a transitional time, I think, in our history.
It was, and listen, there were mistakes that the counterculture made too. I mean, I think there was a snobbishness. I remember when I was a kid, if you smoked dope, you were called a head, and people that didn't get high were called straight. This is pre-gay liberation. Straight meant somebody who was not a stoner, and I looked down on straight people. I thought, being a stoner was like some superior state of mind, and that sort of attitude is very counterproductive, polarizing, and really kind of morally indefensible. If you're going to love everybody, that has to include people that don't listen to the same music you do and don't wear their hair the same way and may not have the same opinions about a given political issue. And this the polarization came from both sides, not only from the right. I think those of us on the left contributed to it, and it's part of what one has to overcome without giving up on moral positions to radiate more the Dr. King kind of love for one's enemies than or political enemies rather than the clenched fist, because I just don't see a lot of positive results coming from the clenched fist.
Yeah. If you, looking back during this period of time, what would you say, and I know there's probably a lot of things, so it's probably a little bit of a loaded question, but what would be one of the instances that you can categorize that really impacted you during this period?
Well, I think the Beatles putting out a song called All You Need Is Love at the peak of their popularity, to take that stance was really incredible, because it's just hard to convey how ubiquitous they were in the culture, how popular. I mean, it was a combination of, you take the biggest stars today, Beyonce or Drake, or, they were not as ubiquitous as the Beatles because you didn't have the fragmentation of the media. You had just a few channels. They were like everywhere in the Western world. And they really identified with the counterculture. I mean, the cover of Sgt. Pepper's, they put themselves in the context of Indian mystics, great writers, philosophers, and so on. Dr. King, Allen Ginsberg, Muhammad Ali, these were like huge celebrities, cover of tabloid types who took moral positions, and in the instance of King and Ali, took great risks. And they just really made me feel something to aspire to. And when I look back on what Muhammad Ali and Dr. King went through when they came out against the war, they had even more opposition in their own communities and in the media and in the mainstream world than I remembered. So it was a period to me when people on the screen of the mainstream culture were wrestling with big moral issues, and to me were really, really inspiring. On a personal level, I just look back on the tiny little things, the sense of community that a couple of million of us had with each other, just looking at each other on the street for that moment before the fashions and the long hair became cliches and co-optable. Again, I don't think tribalism is a good thing. I don't think excluding other people from one's respect or love is a good thing. But the love that some of us did have for each other and the trust is something that I am nostalgic about, and it again gave me something to try to aspire to.
Oh, I can easily see.
I mean, I tell a story in the book about being in an airport barefoot, not being allowed. I don't know why I was barefoot in an airport, but I thought it was cool. I'm not proud of that, but nonetheless, I wanted to get on the plane. They wouldn't let me on. I saw a guy with long hair in the airport, asked him for his shoes, and he gave them to me. That actually happened to me, and it wasn't even a big deal. And that's how we treated each other for a minute. A year or two later, that wouldn't have happened. Too much paranoia. So I am inspired by that moment. I'm not delusional about it. I know it couldn't last forever, but I enjoyed rediscovering it in kind of granular detail to just kind of bring to life something that's usually perceived as a cartoon. And I'm going to do my best to try to, live up to my heroes of that period. They're still heroes to me.
Yeah. What do you think is the legacy that 1967 leaves us today?
Well, I think the positive legacy is, the growth of consciousness. Again, mindfulness, yoga, vegetarianism, alternative medicine, feminism, the gay rights movement, the environmental movement. I think the negative legacy is the polarization and the tribalism that really has, created another feeling of crisis in the country. So I think you've got a good and a bad legacy. I try to focus on the good, but not be naive or blind to the bad. I think we could do better in some respects, and we could live up to the best of them in other respects. So it's a mixed legacy.
I think with every generation, it's that way. Although the 60s were so pronounced, I mean, there was so much going on.
Absolutely. I think the current generation of young people is very exciting to me. They're big, they're progressive, they entered a world that's got a lot of problems we left them with. And I'm biased because I have two kids in their 20s, but as I've met their friends, as I see what that generation is doing politically and culturally, I mean, I think they're a very impressive generation, and they know a lot more about computers than we do, so maybe they can save us.
They they come out of the hospital with an iPhone, basically,
Yeah.
or Android or whatever. But they really are redefining how just not culture, but how businesses work, and it is an exciting time too. So
yeah, I mean, I know there's people in my generation who say, "Oh, our music was better and we were so much more idealistic." I think it's ridiculous. I think music means just as much to young people today as our music did to us. We just got older, and so we don't identify with their music any more than we identified with our parents' music. But they love their music, and it's a connective tissue for them, and they have a interest in activism that, so far to me, a little more thoughtful and impressive than some of what we did. So I'm a big champion of the millennials, and I'm counting on them.
I think we all are, without a doubt. So what's next for you? I mean, because you have so much going on. I mean, you've got this great book, and you're just kind of busy with a little bit of everything.
Well, I've got a day job. I've been in the rock and roll business most of my so-called adult life. I have a little company now that manages 8 or 9 artists, including Steve Earle, a great singer-songwriter, and Against Me, a punk band that just finished a tour with Green Day, and Peaches, and some others. So I do that. I want to keep writing. I've been writing some short pieces for The Nation magazine, trying to connect some of the events of 67 with some of the issues today, 50 years later. And, I'm just going to try to find ways to stay busy and, see if I can keep writing. It's 8 years between books. I hope it's not 8 years till my next book, but I haven't figured out what I want to do next yet. This book's only been out a few weeks and comes out in England next week, and I'm kind of really engaged in plugging it and hoping that people read it and seeing where I can contribute to conversations and just, do whatever I can do, like what you're doing. It's an era. I have a podcast for the Be Here Now network, which, revolves around Ram Dass, where every few weeks I'll talk to somebody about trying to connect spirituality, the so-called real life, and, just do what I can do. It's kind of a lot to me is about kind of dealing with what's in front of you, and that keeps changing. But hopefully I'll find stuff to do as I get older.
Well, I'm definitely going to be watching what you do next. I mean, I love the work you do, and we just wanted to thank you for taking the time to be on the show with us today. Where could our listeners connect with you? Well, I know you've got your personal website, DannyGoldberg.com.
DannyGoldberg.com. My company website is goldve.com. Mm-hmm. And I do have a Twitter handle that I keep forgetting what it's called. I'm new to Twitter. It's It's called @67, but let me just try to.
Well, we will be sharing that so people will know where to find you on social media. So don't worry about that. But they can definitely go to your website at dandygoldberg.com, and they can look at your books, and there's links.
I post. I write these opinion pieces a few times a year. They're all kind of collected there. That's kind of what that site is for. It's just it's a place where some of my writings are and links to the books and so on.
All that good stuff, yeah. Well, Danny, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to tune in today. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Thursday, Friday, and Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.